most of the emphasis of what I've done has been in dryland Africa, and I'm going to draw lessons from Southern Africa research in particular. What we're going to try and do, not just me, but the rest of, hopefully, the rest of this session, is really bring people to the front. When I mean people, I don't just mean the local land users, it's also the people who might instigate change in terms of policymakers, practitioners, and how can we, as a group of scientists, work better with them? How can we understand the routes that science is taking towards influencing policy and try and improve on that? And I think it is a really important aspect that's under-emphasised. I'll go through this in terms of my own personal research journey, which started looking down at the top layer of the soil, like a lot of us. I could have done a talk like Vincent gave, but for Southern Africa, perhaps I still could. I still do little bits of biological soil crust work around the Kalahari. But then it evolved into understanding land management issues in that area, so talking with a farmer there in Namibia, but also into land management issues more broadly in Southern Africa, so that's working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and looking at how different agents are influencing things. So I'll talk about some work there. That's somebody from environmental consultancy talking with extension workers who are paid for by a mining company. What's the role of, corporate responsibility, the role of that mining company in leading to more sustainable land management? And little bits, I've dabbled in Medalus and Desire and Cascade and things like that. So I've done little bits in the Mediterranean basin, as per an even younger picture of me there, and I'll try and mention some of those as I go along. As I was framing this on the plane in yesterday, I just read a couple of high-level documents that have come out of recent conferences, events and the like. It could have been other things. I've been at a climate smart agriculture conference where there was 1,000 people talking about shifts towards putting carbon into agriculture more, similar sort of outputs. Even the EGU, we had a really good session around these sort of issues of how science can better inform policy. But these are just a couple of other recent conferences. The UN's Convention to Combat Desertification, the report of the Committee on Science and Technology on what's needed. And, nice ending, there is not an option to do nothing. But if you actually look at, well, what's the corollary of that? What's the positive we can be doing? A lot of it is just stressing it's about partnership building. It's about understanding who makes decisions and why. How can we influence this multi-stakeholder partnership approach and collaboration? I'll talk little bits about the work we've done to link scientific knowledge with local knowledge to get this hybrid knowledge. Interesting quotes by Klaus Kopfer, the chairman of last week's Global Soils Week, and Gudrun was there, so she might be able to add insights from the floor in Berlin. But again, maybe this is a little controversial for an audience like this, but, do we need much more scientific knowledge, or do we know enough? Yes, you could add further local context studies. Yes, you could reduce the error bars on charts and the like, but actually, we know a lot already. What we really need to be doing is using that in a positive way such that transformations towards more sustainable land management are possible. And I think some of the key issues that we've heard about today, this move towards systems thinking, so Lucas' talk this morning, really powerful in that sort of value of that systems thinking approach, but also the importance of valuation. And I'll talk about some of the work I've done for the Economics of Land Degradation initiative, that again was mentioned this morning, to start to put dollar signs, pound signs, euro signs, whatever you want to put next to some of these issues. And it's kind of dropping off the bottom of the screen there, but at the heart of what I'm going to be talking about is how can we as a group challenge ourselves, and this is kind of, well, I feel like I did it, but have I given up too much of the science would be the question, to be at that interface. So it's not just science full stop, but it's science affecting policy, affecting society, and we're doing that in an action-oriented way. So yes, we are the people trying new restoration techniques and then explaining them locally and trying to get uptake and then monitoring them so that we are part of the change process as well as part of the research process. So before my main case study, which will be on the rangeland work I've done in the Kalahari, I just wanted to, again, it's a big picture sort of thing. We had a talk in Leeds last week by a guy called Simon Maxwell, who heads up £70 million initiative called the Climate Development Knowledge Network, UK and Dutch money going in to try and put that climate agenda into development space more easily. And he was reflecting on, why haven't we won the climate change argument? We've known for 30 years what causes climate change, and yet we're still banging our heads against the brick wall of policymakers saying no, the popular press saying no. And actually, ways to do it, some is to talk simpler, and I think a lot of us, I've been challenged to, that Twitter feed sort of thing, can you say it in 140 characters, Einstein's, can you explain it to a 6-year-old sort of mantra? Can we get messages across, and the positive messages across more simply? I was interested in just looking at the news feeds today. The Pope's got involved now in the climate change thing and is going to host a big science conference on climate change. Maybe his voice will be influential in American politics, whereas Al Gore and others have done a lot of good, but not really seen it through to win the argument, if you were going to look at 2 degrees C or whatever being a pathway to say we could have won that. The other thing is just to say, when we're looking at stories to tell the positives, have a dream of what it can be like. Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare of what it's like now. He had a dream of what it could be like. And we've got to sort of take that positive storytelling mentality and put that forward in sort of schemes that we can look at positively. One key thing that's often overlooked is supporting losers. If you looked at, I was struck by Vincent's sort of map there of the Negev border, and if you look at, well, what could we do if we were to say Egypt needs to move to more sustainable land management, you'd have to put in place some sort of payment scheme or some sort of compensation scheme to give those herders in that area an alternative. It's the same if you're looking at, the big global climate change events. How could we, give alternatives to oil workers or whatever? You need to come up with schemes to support the losers as well as the winners. And that's really important in my Kalahari work. If it's all about, it could potentially be lower grazing levels, what's the scheme that could be put in place to support the people who would lose there? And then in terms of influence, building a leadership group, working with key players across levels. It's not just a Minister of Environment. It might be the local extension worker who's the key player. It might be a local lead farmer who's the key advocate of change. The outsider wouldn't do it, but the inside respected figure would. And then once you have a restoration initiative, just focus on the implementation of that, building coalitions of people to help do it and micromanage to try and get some sort of success story to be able to tell. The final thing I just wanted to reflect on in that regard is the important role, not just of the researchers, but definitely most of what I do now. I will still be doing the formal research on some of the processes here, but it's working through these global bodies. CDK have got a really good blog site and really good networks to big climate and development policymakers across the world. The Economics of Land Degradation Initiative, funded by the Germans and the Koreans, is starting to do a little bit of this on the back of TEEB-like emphasis of valuing land degradation issues. Gudrun asked for either me or Lindsay Stringer, who is another professor in Leeds, who looks even younger than me, and she's currently in Indonesia at a CG annual meeting discussing their funding priorities for the year ahead, and she's there as the head of an international task force on dryland systems to try and advocate the role of CG funds through World Agroforestry Centre, all the ICIMITs and all those, go into these sort of initiatives and continuing the role for dryland. So in a way, our role, I feel, has evolved as researchers to then start to be a little bit of that sort of think tank advocacy, but actually it tends to work best. The Boundary organisation I referred to in there, I'll come back to. They're the advocacy organisation in Southern Africa we work with, who translate our science and get it across in that simple sort of way. So just quickly, in terms of me and what's my route to deandom or whatever else to get to talk about these things. Yes, it started off on soil hydrochemistry in the Kalahari. I've put ... for the papers that I can't remember, but Vincent hopefully has read them about soil crusts in the last 10 or 15 years. But more importantly to me has been the sense that that work was just sort of sitting on a shelf. It wasn't influencing government policy in Botswana. So I did a lot of work to actually understand that better, to get the local voice in more, and then to hold policy workshops. And now we've moved into valuation that I'll talk about today. The overarching theme is one of, yes, is getting the local people involved in the participatory assessment and then linking that to management options. I mentioned before the fact that Leeds has led a role, tends to lead a work block on the end of lots of EU projects. So I was part of Desire and Cascade, there's now Recare. I think Leeds is always work block 8 or 9 or something, doing the social science stakeholder engagement at the end. Actually, should a university be doing that, or should we all be doing that? It's almost saying Leeds shouldn't have a role, but you know, is there a sense that yes, we feel like we've made some change and got people out doing lots of expert interviews and sort of community focus groups, but is that still a little bit of a social science add-on at the end, and can it be mainstreamed more, would be one key question I'd ask. Just a couple of review articles first that we did. Lindsay tends to lead and I tend to follow on a lot of the authorships of these. But we looked at what it would take to manage land for carbon storage. So a lot of what we talked about earlier, yes, organic carbon is the key indicator, whether it's a rangeland soil or whether it's an agricultural soil in southern Africa. And we just mapped out what we felt was needed. Now actually you can see 2/3 of what we said was needed is still above the line of scientific knowledge advances. But even if you had those, the payment schemes, the community institutions, would be a big step to actually get any carbon payment to be lead into community development benefits. And I've highlighted that again in a more review-based article, but just looking at shifts toward community empowerment and community-based monitoring and community-based management. What can we learn from forest systems, which again we might hear more about the dryland forest setting in Africa, but again highlighting that whilst there's opportunity there and there are positive examples of community forestry initiatives, there are many more of elite capture failings where the money's going down the local bar, or perhaps the real benefits are just when it's a community scheme like healthcare or schools provision and everybody buys into the monitoring, the taking photos of trees every year or the monitoring of soils. So just to extend from that, we did a study across 4 southern African countries, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia and the Congo, where we looked at efforts to build these sort of stakeholder partnerships. And there's the image that I talked about around the copper mine project in the Congo. And actually, in a way, that was one of the best practice examples. You say multi-stakeholder partnership, there wasn't the governance side, because that part of DRC is pretty lawless. So basically, the South African homed decisions and actually, yeah, from the boardroom in Johannesburg to put a lot of effort into community development and forest management in and around a mining site will lead into positive examples of sustainable land management and development. Now you can question whether that's a greenwash at an early stage of a project or if it's something that we can build from to upscale more widely, and obviously I'd go for the latter. We looked at a lot of the voluntary carbon market schemes, and I've done similar things in Malawi, looking at Clinton-funded initiatives and others that are getting funding from the Plant Vivo Foundation, where you can offset your carbon emissions. What's that doing? It's having positive advantages when it's sold as explaining it in terms of maize yield. You know, just telling the farmers their hands get dirtier if they rub the soil, you know, is enough, and that you'll get more maize in a dry year. Explaining it like that and then getting the farmers to be able to monitor that and be able to compare and compete with each other and things like that are showing advantages, rather than if you try and explain this is all to do with global climate change and carbon in your soil, which would mean absolutely nothing. So I think there is those sort of efforts that are there, but there are still the concerns about, you know, can we trust every level in the decision making and the money flow process for initiatives like that. So that's just a flavour. The regional environmental change paper is the key output from that if you want to know more. So just as way of a main example, I wanted to just reflect on, it's nearly 25 years worth of work, despite the lack of grey hair yet, in the Kalahari. And a lot of it looking at carbon storage and carbon fluxes, so they're little respiration chambers where me and a colleague are looking at flows of carbon in and out of crusted and disturbed soils. But a lot of it has evolved into producing things like this. So that's a picture of 2 from 2 areas. We worked in 3, and I've brought the desert version because I thought there would be lots of interest in reseeding initiatives and using rygos and bushes to protect sand dunes and things, and I'll mention a little bit more on them. But these guidebooks were produced by a PhD student, Mark Reed, who will be somewhere on there, who worked tirelessly with the local communities to explain what they understand of rangeland changes. But then also, so something like bush encroachment, which I'll come on to, there's a manual in here which explains how to measure it, but then there's also the management options. So uprooting, stem cutting, stem burning, small stock browsing. What are the options if you're faced with bush encroachment in this particular area? If you're faced with dune mobilisation. What are the options that farmers have based on their knowledge and the scientific monitoring? So the key thing there with that was it's that hybrid knowledge. We also got a little bit of extra funds. So Mark was a Leeds PhD student who produced 70-page documents in English. He got extra impact funding from the UK government to translate those into Setswana and Afrikaans. So there are Setswana and Afrikaans versions as well. And now we're working with the IUCN 6 or 7 years later, admittedly, to produce them into 2 or 4 page booklets because the size of those has scared some people and the uptake hasn't been as great as we'd hoped. So I think in a way it shows it's never right perfectly the first time, and it's a journey that is worth that extra effort. Ooh. Something strange is going on here. Was that the right? Yeah, that's right. So let it catch up and then I'll try and get to the right place. Just as an update from that, and not all of this is published yet, but we're now working on an economics of land degradation, oh, we just finished an economics of land degradation study across a transect from Strozen down box pits in the bottom corner of Botswana by the South African-Namibian border up to slightly wetter areas around Verda. 2 scales of analysis, farm scale, landscape scale. The landscape scale is really important because we've worked with remote sensors from Frank Eckhart from UCT to produce the visual images of how it changes through time, and you can't just use the single snapshot. So even our ecological surveys have got a caveat. They were in 2014. It was an incredibly dry year, hence the dead cows on the image there. And that will have affected some of the results that we have gained. Whether they stay or whether they go seems a removable feast. Bush encroachment in this area is the biggest problem. I've got a problem with how to spell it, but so apologies for that. In terms of removal of the perennial grass layer, this would be a predominantly livestock-based system. And the image on the left is from a private farm, the image, a private commercial farm. The image on the right is around one of the main communal villages. Not much difference. Acacia mellifera is a horrible, horrible bush with double spikes that get stuck inside even goats probably, and not that useful, even for charcoal production. So it is having a real impact economically. For the more arid sites, where we've got dune mobilisation in and around the villages, there are restoration initiatives in place to try and reseed, some of it through direct seeding of Stipagrostis amabilis, some of it with the Rhygosan bush, which can be removed and placed to protect it from grazing. As yet, it's not been taken up on the scale that it is over the border in South Africa, and actually one big effort, I was just talking with Ben's about linking more with the work of Klaus Kellner and others on that side of the border to really share good practice examples. There are also problems. When you talk locally, they all blame everything on Prosopis, and yet actually I think we found 3 species when we did all our transects. It's not as endemic and it's not as big a problem as some of the others. The other interesting thing just to stress, I think, is the scope of the challenge of this debate. Soils and their degradation aren't as emotive as wildlife, and yet if we look at this area of southwestern Kalahari, that's just an aerial census of animals. There used to be thousands of wildebeest in this area, but now with vet fences and privatised farms with their own fences, there are very, very few. It wasn't, that happened sort of, not subliminally, it happened quite rapidly actually through the 80s as the fences went up. But even those sort of trophy species didn't lead to major changes in the management of these areas. So will, you know, the conservation of cyanobacterial crusts, carbon storage be a powerful message? What we'll try and do is, or what we're trying to do is show the socioeconomic value of both of those sides of things, the opportunities with ecotourism and the sort of value of the cultural services in these areas, whether it be for housing, construction material like the women collecting thatching grass there, or just trying to get that local knowledge in more. So that just summarises some of the things I've already said. What we did, though, was then hold national workshops with key policymakers, facilitated by the University of Botswana, who also have key chairing roles on major national committees around land degradation and climate change, to just discuss what are the options. What if we did, if you had pro-poor land reform, what would it mean in terms of herd size? So you'd see a drop of the private herd from the blue line to the purple, but actually the communal herd would rise from the pink to the brown, and actually the total herd wouldn't be affected, it would just be the distribution. Actually, when you add in, and that's even with a climate change scenario built in, if you add other aspects in, you start to see how policy decisions play out, and also how climate pays out in terms of looking back at past impacts of drought events and things like that on herd size. So what we've done through this Economics of Land Degradation initiative, again with the University in Botswana, is do more valuation studies, look at market pricing options, look at supply chain issues around things like caracal sheep, what's happening with ecotourism, community-based management issue, natural resource management issues in the area, and actually just then feed that into an improved, what we hope would be an improved valuation of all ecosystem services, and not just the provision and service of how much meat do you get from the land, because that has led to the decision to fence more and graze more. So those are some of the key issues. In terms of how this is playing out, again, there's more information on a website that we've got in Leeds on our ELD work, but we've fed it into multi-criteria decision analyses, interviews with 35 key stakeholders, about 20 of them from the local areas, farmers, government extension workers, and about 14 or 15 experts from universities and government offices. The weighting doesn't change greatly. The key thing is, if you're just wanting to maximize food production, the light blue here, you go with private cattle ranches. But actually, if you want the maximum total value of all ecosystem services, including the cultural, the carbon storage, and everything, then the communal system is the most effective and efficient. So we're hoping that might help guide future decision making. Some lessons on what I see as the key steps to go from science into policy. Impacts are one, that actually the fact that I have kept looking at the soil crust does give me a little bit of credibility that actually we've advanced the understanding of carbon fluxes in this area over a long period, and seen that as to how does it vary with wet years, dry years, fire events, policy change, grazing regimes, that it's linked in at a high level, largely through collaborators within country. And whenever possible, we've facilitated, even just with little funds, when I didn't have project funds, I would use university funds, can do it even more now, to hold national workshops and things like that, so that there's a regular sort of, we haven't gone away, we are still talking to about management options. When they say we've tried this, we can go back and assess how it's changed through time. Currently, the IUCN have shown interest, so we'll extend that link. I'll pass on a Swaziland reference, but it's there just to say that we've worked on these similar issues in other countries, and if Lindsay had been here, you'd have had 15 minutes on Swaziland. He's given me 5 minutes. No, I won't go back. I'll leave it there. If you want to look up more, there's a website which says we've done similar things in Swaziland, but with a female research face rather than a male one. The way we've kind of always viewed this, and as I say, the fact that Lindsay's away currently with the CG, the fact that she was a key player in the UNCCD scientific conference, her and Mark Reed wrote the Impulse report that guided the discussions at that scientific conference, and therefore I wasn't surprised to see some of the chairman's sort of findings at the end about the importance of these sort of processes, has been to make sure that the scientific research we do doesn't just sit at that local level, but it's been proactively fed into the national and the international arena. There's a lot of talk in the academic literature about science moving towards sustainability science. To me, that means identifying issues at that cross scales, not just the local scale. Partly that's through proactive stakeholder analysis of understanding who are the key agents, who could lead change in a particular area. Often it's policymakers and NGOs, but it might be the chief in a village, or it might be an outside researcher who's got the trust and respect. In the sense of building on the good news stories, use those for the short, pithy messages. Don't just stop at the academic paper. Keep pushing it, keep monitoring A lot of what we talked about this at the EGU, the importance of the fact that it's been continual and it's been going back and monitoring, asking the same questions at different times. Key policy moments, there's a change of a Minister of Environment, there's a change of a local extension worker, go and do the same survey again, those kind of things. And really use those communication networks. As I say, the role of boundary agents have been particularly interesting to me as to people who set themselves up as sort of consultants to take the scientific output and advocate that to policymakers at a range of different levels. What we're trying to do now is scale up with these quantitative assessments with the pound signs and see what value that will have. In terms of an overview of the impacts we feel we've already had, the UK went through this horrible thing called a research evaluation framework recently, and me and Lindsay were there as an impact case study for Leeds. So we've written up our reflections on how we might have had impact in terms of policy in the dryland sphere as an article there in the Journal of Environmental Management. But a key thing in this sort of jigsaw picture is start from the beginning of identifying the knowledge gaps you're going to fill, but not just the knowledge gaps, also the key players, and build them into the research design process and disseminate and communicate regularly. And if there's a policy opportunity, if Botswana needs to do its third national communication on climate change, you get to the office door and feed in what does land degradation mean for climate change in Botswana. So in a way, those are just the steps that I feel I've taken and would advocate others thinking outside the box of just being soil scientist or whatever, and thinking through, can we become more action oriented? Can we overcome that angst? Ecologists, soil scientists, we chose this career because we didn't have to speak to people sort of thing, that actually we force ourselves into those sort of situations and work with others who are good at it. There are people who are proactively doing this advocacy role in most countries, actually in Southern Africa, and I'm sure it's the same here in Mediterranean Europe. And they're just some of the challenges we've seen along the way. So that's where there's further information, and thank you.